come before me. Particularly the last one has covered a lot of stuff that's probably going to be similar to some of the messages that we're going to hear through Malachi. Now we're going to start off in a really weird place, and that's the very, very end of the chapter. In the summation, if you've got a Bible handy, you might like to turn to these verses. We're going to Malachi chapter 4, verse 4 to 6. Now when we read these verses in Malachi chapter 4, verses 4 to 6, I'm going to give you a moment to turn it up. Interesting to think about where we are in the Bible. We are in the very end of the messages that were given to the Israelite people. And so it makes us wonder, what would be the message? If God had a people, if he had a chosen people, what would he want to say to them at the very, very end? Reading from verse 4 to 6. Remember ye the law of Moses, my servant, which I commanded unto him in Horeb for all Israel, with the statutes and the judgments. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord, and he shall turn the heart of the fathers to the children, and the heart of the children to the fathers, lest I come and smite the earth with a curse. And so we can see at the very end there, what we're seeing is that the most important part is probably the beginning of verse 4, that we are not to forget those things that God commanded from Moses' time, and obviously in the law and the prophets. And we are talking about one of the messages given by a prophet in our topic of Micah. So before we go into study a bit more about Micah, something's definitely different about Malachi, I should say. Malachi, the only time you'll find that word in the Bible is once, and that is in Malachi 1 verse 1. Now, I don't know about you, but whenever someone's only mentioned once in the Bible, it's normally a sign that there's either they're not important or there's something just not quite right here, because this is one of the whole books of the Bible. We are introduced to all the other prophets that we've heard of today. For example, we've heard that Zephaniah was the son of Cushi. He was in the days of Josiah, so you get a name, you get a father, you get times. Haggai, we get told it was the second year of King Darius to Zerubbabel. We get told that Zerubbabel was the governor of Judah, and we also hear that Joshua, the son of Jodak, was there to hear Haggai's message. So there's a lot of history and topics, well, not a lot, but there's information given around the other prophets. Not this one, not Malachi. Again, only translated once in Malachi 1 verse 1. Malachi means my messenger. Now I don't want to go into words and the meaning of words and translations of words, so I'm going to keep this real brief. Malachi, translated only once, has a male tone to it when the interpreters interpreted the word. It has an I on the end, which the other word, Malachi, meaning my message, or Malach, I should say, doesn't have the I on the end. So you're looking at two different words, 4397 versus 4401. Now if you've got your Bibles in front of you, stay in Malachi. You might like to have a look at chapter 3 verse 1. If you look at chapter 3 verse 1, they did translate that one as my messenger versus the name, or the noun, the name, Malachi. The reason I bring this up is I don't want to get into a conversation or an argument about meanings of words, but there is, if we look at what the Jews believe and what some of the ancient Jews believe, a understanding, like the Septuagint puts, that the actual translation should be by the hand of the messenger. And so it changes it from a name to the actual idea that this is a message from God and given by the hand of a messenger. Either way, we do not know any details about Malachi or the messenger, and that's where I want to leave that. What I would say though is that in the Tanakh, which was a version of the Old Testament that was given by word, so they didn't necessarily always have scriptures and partial parchments to actually read from. So there was a verbal shared knowledge that they would recite of the Old Testament. And in the shared knowledge of the recited Old Testament, when they recited this part of of Malachi, they would actually say, by the hand of my angel whose name is called Ezra the scribe. Again, it doesn't matter who this message comes from. The main thing is what it says. And what it says is God's last message to his people. So I'm not expecting you to be able to read all this. I just thought this was really interesting that when you have a look at this is the history completely as we know it from the Jews. If you're interested in what the troughs and the peaks are, that's the actual population of Jews at the time. So we're sitting over on the right-hand side, up to about 16.6 million at the Holocaust, minus 6 million after that. Obviously, it drops down a bit. And this is actually living in the land of Israel, not talking about people that are the diaspora living throughout the world. We are briefly talking about today, when we look at the prophets at the time period around about, or my prophet in particular, Malachi, sitting around about 430, 470. So we're sitting around about here in the history of the Jews, just after the kings and the prophets. Really good slide if you wanted to find that one on the internet. That was just the history of the Jews and the heritage. When you blow it up, there's some really deep detail in there. I'm going to pop some of that out for you. Let's blow it up. So we're looking at this period of time over here. We know that we had our exile of Jews people, of God's people. God's people, Israelites, they were not doing the right thing, as they had done many times before. We know that they were kicked out of their land. And then after being in exile for a number of years, 70 years, they returned to the second temple building, which all of our prophets today have been dealing with, and last night. Now, in particular, Malachi, or the message from Malachi, is about 100 years after the return to the land, and we've just heard from Craig, all of that stuff that he was talking about, it's just been happening. So this idea that they weren't doing a good job at rebuilding the temple, they were spending way too much time building their own places. This message that's about to come to us is straight on the back of that one. So before we go into that message, it's interesting to think about what Craig was talking about. A lot of that topic that he was talking about with the temple, God from the time that he chose his people had ways that they were supposed to serve him. And so if we go back and think about at the very beginning, we had our tabernacle, and that was in the tent. And then it gradually changed over time until the first temple. And then finally, we're talking about the times of the second temple build, which obviously wasn't as good as the time of Solomon, as we just had a chat about in the last talk. And then obviously Jesus around the beginning of the last 2,000 years. All right, so let's get stuck into where we're at. We've talked about the fact that it's been about 100 years. The same things that we just heard, there is corruption happening in the temple. The actual priests themselves are not serving God in the way that they had been commanded to serve God. The people are not serving God the way they should be serving God. All the things that we just heard, poverty, the crops weren't growing properly. And again, if you wanted to go deeply into that, the whole chapters of Ezra and Nehemiah spend a lot of time in this time period. All right, so back to this idea of Malachi 1 verse 1, the burden of the word of the Lord to Israel by Malachi. Now that was used by Haggai as well at the very beginning. The burden of the word of the Lord. And that's basically what his people had become. The people he loved, his people, were just a burden. And this is the last message that he's going to give them. So, in Malachi, what we see is a number of what we're going to call disputes, and I will reference the Bible Project as we've seen a number of videos already given to us today for giving us some of the resources that we're using. So in these disputes, often you'll see a claim, so something that God will say, and then there's this imaginary, I'll call it imaginary argument, because this is Malachi the prophet or the messenger giving this message. So there's not a to and fro conversation here with the people. This is God's message to his people. So the way God puts this message out there, he makes a claim. It could be something like, you haven't served me properly, or you don't love me. And then they'll say, how haven't we loved you? And they'll try, there's this argument or disagreement, you'd like to call it. And then God will clarify in his response what he means by you don't love me. That's just an example. So we're going to dive deeply and unpack the whole book of four chapters of Malachi, and we're going to use this resource. So this is the map that they come up with the Bible Project, and we're going to do a bit of activity in the next room very shortly.
The book of the prophet Malachi. He lived about 100 years after the Israelites had returned from their Babylonian exile, and his message was directed to the people who had been living in Jerusalem for some time now. The temple had been rebuilt a while ago, and things were not going well. Just remember the stories from Ezra and Nehemiah. Now, when the Israelites first returned from exile, their hopes were high. They would return and rebuild their lives and the temple. All of the great promises of the prophets would come true. The Messiah would come and set up God's kingdom over a unified Israel and over the nations and bring justice and peace for all. But that's not what happened. The Israelites who repopulated the city proved to be just as unfaithful to God as their ancestors, resulting in poverty and injustice. And so in Malachi, we find out just how corrupt this new generation has become. The book's designed as a series of disputes, and most sections begin with God saying something, making a claim or an accusation, and then Israel will disagree or question God's statement. And then God will respond and offer the last word. This happens 6 times. In the first 3 disputes, God exposes Israel's corruption, and in the final 3 disputes, he confronts their corruption. And the overall impression you get from these arguments and disputes is that the exile fundamentally didn't change anything in the people. Israel's hearts are as hard as ever. The first dispute starts when God says that he still loves his covenant people despite their failures. And Israel rudely objects, saying, "How have you shown us any love?" And so God reminds them of how he graciously chose the family of Jacob, their ancestor, to become the carrier of God's covenant promises, instead of Esau, his brother, and the family that came from him, who eventually came to ruin. Remember the stories from Genesis and the book of Obadiah. And so right from this first dispute, Israel is exposed as suspicious, doubting God's love and faithfulness. The second dispute exposes a problem with Israel's second temple. God accuses the people of despising and defiling the temple. And the people fire back, "How have we despised you?" And so God responds by focusing on the people, how they're bringing shamefully lame offerings of these sick, blemished animals that show that they don't value or honor their God. But it's not just the people, it's the priests too who run the temple. They not only tolerate but participate in these corrupt forms of worship. From top to bottom, God's people have proven faithless. In the third dispute, God accuses the Israelite men of treachery against him and their wives, which of course they deny. And God exposes the toxic combination of idolatry and divorce taking place. You have Israelite men marrying non-Israelite women and then adopting the worship of their wives' ancestral gods into their homes. Remember the story from Nehemiah chapter 13. And so Malachi connects this to a wave of men divorcing their wives for no good reason. And the people are all fine with this. And Malachi says, no, it's a betrayal of your covenant with God. And so Malachi transitions into the second set of disputes that confront Israel's rebellion. So the fourth dispute begins with the Israelites accusing God of neglect, saying, "Where is the God of justice?" They see injustice and corruption abounding, and God seems to do nothing. So God responds by saying that he'll send a messenger who will prepare the people for God's personal return in the day of the Lord. He will come like fire to purify his people and to remove idolatry and sexual immorality and injustice so that only the faithful remnant is left to become his people. In the fifth dispute, God calls the people to turn back to him, to which the people say, "How can we turn back?" And so God confronts their selfishness. He shows how they've stopped offering a tithe of their income to the temple. Now, that word tithe just means 1/10. It's the amount of their income and produce that the Israelites were to annually donate to support the temple and its priests. The practice is laid out in different parts of the Torah. Now, we know from Malachi and from the book of Nehemiah that the people were neglecting this responsibility. And so the temple was falling into disrepair. And so God confronts them. He says he wants to bless them with abundance, but only if they're going to be faithful. In the final dispute, the people accuse God and say that it's pointless to serve him. They observe wicked, prideful people succeeding in life, and God does nothing. And God's response, for the first time in the book, is not a speech, but rather a short story about the faithful remnant in Israel, people who fear the Lord and they love to get together and talk about how to honor God and serve Him. And so God orders that a scroll of remembrance be written for these people so that they can read the scroll and remember God's character and promises. Malachi, he's reflecting here on the divine gift of the Scriptures, how they point us to the past to remember what God has done in order to inspire faithfulness and hope for the future. Which leads to the conclusion of the book. It picks up and develops the imagery of the fourth dispute about the coming day of the Lord, but it develops it further. God says that He's appointed a day of purifying judgment that will consume the wicked from among His people. But what the conclusion adds is the future of the faithful remnant, because for them, the day of the Lord is not a threat, it's a cause for joy. It'll be like the rays of the rising sun that bring healing and life and hope for the future. And so Malachi's disputes come to a close, but there's still a bit more to this book. The final 3 verses, they're not part of the disputes, and actually they function like a concluding appendix, bringing closure not just to Malachi, but to the whole collection of the Torah and the prophets. So first, the reader is called to remember the law, or the Torah, of my servant Moses. This recalls the story and the laws of the covenant that you find in the first 5 books of the Bible. But then we hear this summary of the books of the prophets. I will send the prophet Elijah before the day of the Lord, who will restore the hearts of God's people. So this conclusion, it summarizes the Torah and the prophets as a unified story that points to the future. Israel was redeemed by God, and then they betrayed Him through their rebellion and hard hearts, breaking the laws of the Torah. But the Scriptures anticipate a future day when God's going to send a new prophet, a Moses, a new Elijah, who will restore God's people and heal their hard hearts. Remember all of the promises from Deuteronomy and Jeremiah and Ezekiel. And so this concluding appendix presents the Scriptures as a divine gift to read and to ponder and to pray over. They tell the truth about the human condition, about our selfishness and our sin. But they also announce God's promise that one day He would send a messenger and then show up personally to confront evil, to restore His people and bring His healing justice. And it's that future hope that Malachi and the Torah and all of the prophets are about.